Chapter 11, we're going to discuss some ways that we take things, behaviors that we have learned, and modify them in our environment. We're going to talk about a few concepts: generalization, discrimination, and something called stimulus control. Video 1 will focus specifically on generalization, and we'll proceed with the other types of behavioral changes with Video 2. So to start, we want to define what the term generalization means. Generalization is the tendency that we have for learning to spread or transfer, and that can be done in a lot of different ways. We can spread or transfer learning across people, something called vicarious generalization, across time, which we call response maintenance. This is actually the opposite of forgetting, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Across behavior, something called response generalization, or across situation, which we call stimulus generalization. We talked about generalization across people last chapter when we discussed observational learning, and that's essentially what observational learning is. We generalize a behavior from one person, the person that we're observing, to ourselves. So learning moves from the model to the observer, generalizes from the learner to the observer. That's generalization across people. Generalization across time is something we're actually going to talk about in the next chapter when we talk about forgetting. So we'll get to that later on. Then we have generalization across behavior. And this is what we refer to as response generalization, and is a very interesting psychological phenomenon. This is when change in one behavior actually spreads to another behavior. So if you think about a lot of the behaviors we've talked about when looking at classical and operant conditioning, things like animals learning how to do tricks or perform certain behaviors, we can actually think about times that those behaviors, those changes, spread to other similar behaviors. For example, if we reinforce someone for saying hello to other people, they're going to essentially be learning that I can be reinforced for talking to other people. So they might generalize that behavior of saying hello to the behavior of asking people how they're doing. And that's generalization across two different behaviors. I generalize what I learned about saying hello to people to asking people how they're doing. Another example, if I reward a child for sharing or sharing one specific toy, they might, after that, start sharing toys more often. Or if I reward a child for being willing to share, not necessarily sharing, but when they're playing alone, being willing to share, they might start actually engaging in that behavior more. If you reward a dog for sitting, the dog might start to lie down because they learn that if I do this type of behavior, this other similar type of behavior might evoke the same response from my environment. Response generalization. Then we have generalization across situations, or stimulus generalization. To understand this term, I want you to think about the different times we've talked about stimuli. What stimuli are happening in the environment when we're learning? Oftentimes, those stimuli can generalize. So, stimulus generalization is a change in behavior that happens in one situation occurring in another situation or spreading to another situation. We know that responses to stimuli not present during training can actually happen after training has occurred. So, the best example I have of stimulus generalization is actually baby Albert. Hopefully you watched that video back when we talked about classical conditioning. To refresh your memory, baby Albert was trained to be afraid of white rats. Every time he saw a white rat, a loud, scary noise was played behind him. He was conditioned this way to fear white rats. Specifically, the white rat in this example is the stimulus. However, researchers observed that after conditioning, he wasn't just afraid of white rats. He was also afraid of Santa, white fuzzy beard, bunnies, white and furry blankets. That is stimulus generalization. You generalize the response you have for the stimuli that was specifically included in your conditioning to any stimuli that reminds you of it. And this can occur with non-specific behaviors, things like crying, or even learned helplessness, okay? You might develop learned helplessness in a math class, and generalize that to a science class as well, or even a relationship. That brings us to extinction. Similarly to operant and classical conditioning, extinction can actually spread beyond a specific situation. So just like stimulus generalization can happen with one stimuli to another, extinction can happen this way also. So imagine that you've learned to press a button in your home to turn a light on. Afterwards, you get lights installed throughout the entire building, and you know that you press that same button in each room and it turns the lights on. One day, you go in the room and you try to press the button. You're trying to press the button all day, and nothing happens. You're actually not just going to stop pressing lights in that specific room, but you'll stop pressing the button in every room of the house. The behavior goes extinct across stimuli, not just for the specific stimuli that you were conditioned to. Works the same for reinforcement and punishment. It doesn't matter what type of training, what type of conditioning had occurred. When extinction happens due to one stimulus, it generalizes oftentimes, but not every time, to all stimuli that you've generalized to. Another example, if you're punished for talking at school, you might be less likely to talk at home. Another thing I want to point out about stimulus generalization is that learning doesn't always spread to other stimuli. It happens. We call that stimulus generalization. But we know that certain situations can cause it to happen, while certain settings or variables can prevent generalization from happening. So the question we want to look at now is, how can we make people generalize? There's lots of behaviors that we might want people to generalize from one stimuli to another. For example, if you're trying to teach your child to be well-mannered, to say thank you and no thank you, please and thank you. You want to teach them to do that behavior not just at home, but out in public, at school, when you're at your place of worship, etc., etc. So how can we increase the likelihood that generalization will occur? The biggest way to do this is to train or condition in multiple settings. Don't just focus on your pleases and thank yous at home, but make sure you're doing it in the grocery store, when you're out at dinner. When we're learning in a more complex environment or across different environments, we are much more likely to generalize to different environments as well, and to perform that behavior across the board. Providing lots of examples helps also. We say please and thank you when this happens, we say please and thank you when this happens, and so on and so forth. A great example, if you think about learning math problems, we actually tend to really focus on stimulus generalization. You don't just work the same math problem over and over again, but rather you're forced to do tons and tons and tons, my math haters know that, of different math problems that use the same principles, so that you learn to generalize them to all of the different places and times and situations where those principles are applicable. We also know that it's important, or helps generalization, to vary the consequences of the behavior. Remember learning about stretching the ratio? That actually helps with stimulus generalization. And then another interesting one is to reinforce generalization itself. Just like we talked about reinforcement of imitation when we talked about observational learning, we can actually reinforce generalization itself to make it more common in a specific subject. And all you do for that is to provide a positive reinforcement anytime generalization occurs. Your dog lays down instead of just sitting. Good boy, here's your treat. That will actually teach the dog to generalize that behavior. We call this generalization therapy. We can actually help people get better or worse at this behavior. That brings me to the end of video 1. I'll pick up with video 2, looking at discrimination.